Bono Law, hosted by Patrick Bracher, is proudly brought to you by ProBono.org and Norton Rose, South Africa, in association with the Constitution Hill Trust. ProBono.org, actively increasing access to justice.
Welcome to 1485 Pro Bono Law. This is your host, Patrick Bracher, welcoming you to another program where we deal with the Constitution as it plays its way out in Southern Africa. And I say Southern Africa deliberately today because we're spreading our wings a bit wider than usual with the backing of ProBono.org. Regular listeners will know that ProBono.org is a public interest law clearinghouse, as we call it. What they do is they put people in search of justice, in touch with people who are prepared to give them access to justice, and they do a fantastic job in that respect. Now, access to justice is sort of broadly what we're talking about today, but it's more particularly HIV and discrimination in law in Southern Africa. And I'm welcoming the Deputy Director and HIV Program Manager at the South African Litigation Centre, and she'll tell you more about what they do in a minute. Priti Patel, welcome here today. It's very nice to have you to talk to us.
Thank you for having me.
It's nice to do it, and we are in what people generally call the silly season, but we do need to be reminded that there are things out there that aren't so silly and that need the support of people like you. Can you tell us, first of all, perhaps what your institute does in Southern Africa? As you do some very important work, and I'd like the listeners to know before we give the particular examples.
Sure. So as you said, I work for the Southern Africa Litigation Centre. We are a nonprofit organization based in South Africa, but we work in 10 countries in Southern Africa. And what we do is we work with local lawyers and local civil society organizations in country to bring strategic litigation cases on key human rights and rule of law issues. So I particularly work on HIV-related litigation, but we have programs that work on freedom of expression, freedom of information cases. We have a prisoners' rights program that ensures the rights of prisoners across Southern Africa, and we also have a program that focuses on international criminal justice. And
particularly use quite a good weapon, and that is litigation. You will take issues to court in order to force the pace if people won't do it voluntarily. And that is a good weapon, isn't it? I mean, it's expensive and slow, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I think the biggest or the most interesting thing is that one of the things that we do is that we use litigation as an advocacy tool, what we call an advocacy tool. So yes, we always work with civil society organizations to ensure that even though there may be a case happening in court, there's also pressure being mounted outside of the courtroom on other areas of government to ensure that, what we think should happen happens.
Yes. And you call it strategic litigation, which means you take points of principle which will have a broader effect than simply the litigant you're acting for.
Absolutely.
And we'll give some examples of that in a minute. One of the distinguishing features of the countries in which you operate in Southern Africa is many of them, probably most of them, have a Bill of Rights. They have a constitution as good as we do, I suppose. And even Namibia, some people might say, broader. And you're working within a framework of a Bill of Rights.
Yeah, I mean, South Africa, of course, has one of the best constitutions in the world.
Yes.
And in many ways, the most, in Southern Africa, the most recently enacted constitution.
Yes.
And therefore, South Africa has the right to health and the right to other socioeconomic rights, which a lot of the countries we work in don't. Mm-hmm. Having said that, every single country that we work in, all the common law English-speaking countries, have a Bill of Rights that ensures the right to life, the right to dignity, the right to be free from discrimination, the right to privacy to some extent, the right to security of the person.
And as people may have guessed, you've got some USA training from your accent. So that helps because the American Bill of Rights doesn't have specific social and economic rights, does it? One sort of extrapolates things from the basic law into real rights for people. You can take dignity and equality and do quite a lot with them to get rights for HIV positive people.
I actually, one of the things that's been really interesting about working in Southern Africa, and in my previous experience, I've worked in the U.S. and I've also worked in South Africa, but working in Southern Africa is much more similar to working in terms of litigation in the U.S., because you do have to extend these rights. You have to convince the court that the right to dignity includes the right to health. Well, that hasn't been the case for lawyers in South Africa because you have a specific right.
Yes.
So the litigation in some ways is differently creative than it is here.
Yes, and I mean, we've got here the Promotion of Equality Act, which particularly brings HIV status into equality rights. But that's not always the same help in other countries. Can you give us some examples of what work you're doing in Southern Africa in relation to HIV rights? And we'll go further from that in a minute.
So we, as I said, we work with local lawyers and local civil society to bring certain types of cases. And one of the things that we've really thought about is, we know the groups that are most affected by HIV, and they do tend to be women, men who have sex with men, and sex workers.
Yes.
And so a lot of our litigation in the region focuses on those three specific groups. So, for example, we are working on a case in Malawi with, again, a local lawyer and a local civil society organization called the Center for the Development of People, around challenging the mandatory HIV testing of sex workers.
Yes.
And one of the things that we're arguing is that you can't actually test anybody without their informed consent for HIV because it's a violation of their core constitutional rights, including their right to dignity and their right to the security of the person.
Yes.
In that case, hopefully, we haven't had a government response yet, but is in the High Court in Malawi at the moment.
I mean, that's the ultimate privacy right, isn't it? Your health status is a very important personal right.
Well, and what's interesting is that it's not only that it's an important personal right, but that a lot of the HIV studies have shown that when you forcibly test people for HIV, they're less likely to actually get treatment and deal with the fact that they have the illness. So it just sets you further back in terms of trying to, get people on treatment and save their lives and to stop them from spreading the illness. So it not only is, our argument is not only rooted in the law, but it's also rooted in this public health argument that, if you want to see a society that's HIV-free to some extent or on HIV treatment, then you need to actually abide by the principles in the Constitution.
Yes, and they work positively, don't they? I mean, if you use them properly, they work positively, and people get the treatment or get the awareness, avoid the stigma, do come forward. It has all sorts of positive outcomes if you deal with it positively. Yeah. Give me an example of what's happening in the courts in Malawi in that regard.
I think that the courts are probably not as supportive in Malawi of these types of cases. Having said that, for example, we have a case in Malawi at the moment around women's property rights. So in Malawi, I think very much from the English law, English common law, they've kept a law that says when women get divorced, they have to show that they contributed monetarily to the property.
Yes.
And if they can't show that, then the husband gets all the property.
Yes.
And of course, as we know, especially in rural communities, maybe the man goes out and works, but the woman enables him to actually be able to do that, right?
Correct.
Because she runs the household, and then at divorce she gets nothing, which of course in the HIV context means that, she might be infected and doesn't have the economic means to get treatment. She has if she isn't infected, she doesn't have the economic means to protect herself from getting infected.
Yes.
And so we've raised a challenge at the constitutional court level as a violation of the discriminatory protection in the Constitution. And the court seemed very open. I mean, we don't have a ruling yet, and we've been waiting a year, so that's not necessarily a positive thing. Yeah. But they seem more willing to entertain those types of cases.
Yes.
But I think, in South Africa, as well as the region, sex worker rights issues around men having sex with men are incredibly contentious, to say it kindly.
But I mean, even on the equality, it's not simply divorce either, is it? It's inheritance. I mean, a woman in Africa often can't inherit from a deceased husband, and it may be a husband who has infected her and died of AIDS. Now the poor wife and mother is left assetless and incomeless with the disease and no way of coping with it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think one of the hardest things for us has been that a lot of these a lot of courts in the region may be open to challenges to discriminatory inheritance laws or property laws.
Yes.
But it's very hard to find women who are willing to come forward to challenge them.
Yes.
And I think unlike South Africa, the rest of the region actually has very narrow standing rules. So an organization couldn't bring a challenge such as that.
Yes.
And given the fact that most women are disempowered in the region, it is very hard to have them challenge those laws. So we haven't been able to overturn them.
I mean, to find a woman to challenge those laws, A, she would have to be quite a strong character to stand up against the community. B, just to come forward at all is not easy without any resources. And what you're often dealing with here is rural people, isn't it? It's not high-powered city people. Occasionally you'll find a good plaintiff maybe who's got the resources, and you were telling me about one. Perhaps we'll go back to that in Lesotho. But it's not easy to find the litigant.
Yeah. No, and I mean, as you just mentioned, we have this wonderful litigant in Lesotho who's willing to challenge. She's the eldest child of a chief.
Yes.
And the Chieftainship Act in Lesotho just on its face says the eldest male should succeed. Yeah, it's very clear.
Yes.
It's very clear. And she challenged it. And she's an incredibly strong person, and I think, saw this and knows the Constitution and thought this is not constitutional. But that's really rare. And I think one of the things we've been trying to do in Botswana still permits marital rape. So if you get raped by your husband, that is not illegal and it's not criminalized. And we've been trying to challenge that for ages in the courts, and it is very hard to find a woman who's willing to take her husband to court. I mean, of course. And yet, again, that means the woman cannot get HIV treatment if she's afraid she's been infected. Emergency HIV treatment.
When is the Lesotho case likely to come to court or come to judgment? Have you any idea? Because that's a very interesting case indeed, because it's completely contrary to their Bill of Rights, isn't it? It shouldn't be lost, that case.
No. We're hoping that it will be heard sometime next year. We have intervened as amicus, partly to just brief the court on the international regional law obligations of Lesotho, and also to point out other cases. Like South Africa has a very similar case in Bay that dealt with a very similar issue. Right. And so we want to make sure that the Lesotho court knows about these other cases when it makes its decision, and we're hoping that it'll be heard next year.
Oh, good. Well, I hope you get a date soon, because it does seem like an unlosable one on any Bill of Rights test.
Let's hope.
Well, give it my backing if you like. I'm not sure that's worth a great deal.
Yeah, that would be great.
Swing to the west coast, Namibia. You've been doing work in Namibia. Just give us an example of, because Namibia had a Bill of Rights when they got their freedom. That was long before South Africa. Not quite as modern a Bill of Rights, but still a very broad brush rights, if you take away the socio-economic rights we have. Is that right?
No, absolutely. They have an incredibly strong constitution. And one of the big cases we're working on right now in Namibia is around the forced sterilization of HIV-positive women. And the same thing has been documented in South Africa as well.
Can you give the listeners just some idea of how that happens to women in daily life? Yeah,
so one of the women that is a litigant, she got pregnant. She went to the local public hospital. The doctor had told her she needed a cesarean section. And then the day that she went in for her scheduled cesarean section, he then informed her that she had to consent to a sterilization. Otherwise, he wouldn't be able to do the cesarean section.
Yes.
She was under the impression that she had to have a cesarean section for her own medical needs to save her life, but also to save the life of the baby and to ensure the baby wasn't infected with HIV.
That's the pressure you're under, of course. If somebody says you better have one or your life's at stake, then you haven't got much choices left, have you?
No.
And what was she told then? I mean, how does...
So she initially said no, and then he came back and said, look, these are the only options you have. And so then she finally consented to the sterilization.
Well, consent in a very narrow sense. I mean, she signed a consent form without any real, true, informed consent that you need in law.
Yeah, and consented under duress, right? So... And that's just one of the cases. So we've also had a number of other cases where women are in labor and they're on sort of the gurney to go into the operation theater, and they're handed a stack of forms to sign, and they assume it's for the delivery, and so they sign a bunch of forms, and it's only when they... In one case, a woman didn't even know she was sterilized until she went back a few months later to get contraception.
Yes.
And they looked at her medical records, and they told her she didn't need contraception anymore because
so
she was
you
sterilized.
don't even know it's happened to you.
Yeah.
You're not asked, you're not told, and off you go.
And the problem has been is that, Namibia does have this amazing Bill of Rights and strong protections in the Constitution, but the government's argument has been it's illegal, but it isn't happening.
Yes.
And something like informed consent that happens between a medical professional and an individual woman is incredibly hard to sort of shine a light on.
Yes.
And so we've had to really document the practice happening across the board among a number of women at the same hospital. And we've actually documented it throughout Namibia.
What is the solution to that? Would one need a independent third party present when the consent is given, or how would you ensure that these consents are true consents? Because it's easy to get a signature on a paper under duress.
Yeah, at a minimum, my sense is that the Department of Health in Namibia could easily train healthcare workers on how to go about obtaining informed consent. Here are the steps. Here's the information you need to tell the person. It has to be in the person's language.
Yes.
Here's how much time it would take to go through all of this information.
Yes.
And then to actually act when there's a complaint against a healthcare worker for not having given informed consent.
Yes.
To actually act and investigate and then hold the person responsible if they're found guilty. And none of that is happening, right? So the argument has been we're just so busy.
Yes.
But that can't possibly be.
Yeah, that can't be a reason to sterilize somebody without consent.
Yeah.
I'm talking to Priti Patel from the Southern Africa Litigation Centre. She specializes in HIV litigation, strategic litigation, to get governments and others to recognize their true role under the Bill of Rights. Can we just go on about sterilization? Sterilization is a big problem, isn't it, in African and not only African, just world context, because men and their families and mothers and everybody wants you to have children. You go home and say, I'm sterilized, you're not a welcome wife always anymore. Isn't that the tragedy?
Yeah. I think a lot of our clients in this particular case have raised, I think, a real problem, which is they're told they're HIV positive at the outset, and then they're told every time you have sex with your husband, you need to use a condom.
Yes.
But when they go home, they're told by their in-laws and their husband that they need to have children because that is part of what it means to be married.
Yes.
And so they're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place.
Yes.
And so what they end up doing for making the decision to ensure their safety in a household setting, they have unprotected sex with their husband. And then they get pregnant and are taken to the hospital and sterilized. And then they go home and they're no longer able to bear children. And so a number of our clients have been kicked out of the house. A number of them face violent situations in the home. So they're not kicked out yet, but they're subjected to severe abuse because they're not allowed to have children. And they feel that not only now are they HIV positive, but they're losing the sort of economic and social support that they had within this family structure. And, again, one of the things that we've been pushing for, not through the litigation but through the advocacy, has been that healthcare workers and governments need to contextualize the HIV epidemic, that it's really great for medical people to say, never have unprotected sex again. But everybody knows that's ridiculous. It's never going to happen. So let's start having candid conversations with women about what it is that they need and how to best protect their health and their partner's health.
Yes. You've got a big dilemma, haven't you? Because on the one hand, you've got health workers who are doing things that are really unacceptable and should be prosecuted. On the other hand, you need the health workers to be the educators, because the newspapers can't do it and the radio. It's the face-to-face health worker-patient relationship which you rely on to get the word across. So I suppose it's a bit of a problem.
Well, I think the biggest thing that this case and other cases have really brought up is how even, 20 years after sort of the dark days of the AIDS epidemic, there's still such a severe stigma against HIV. So a lot of the women we talk to still report, being kicked by healthcare workers, being discriminated against just because of their HIV status. And we need to do more in terms of reducing the stigma.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, when you think of the number of people who are infected, it's crazy to have any kind of stigma because we've got to face it head on.
And that all of us have a friend or a family member who is HIV positive and lives with HIV, right?
It's sure to be the case, isn't it? I mean, certainly in Southern African terms. Can we move on to the plight of sex workers? Because South Africa itself hasn't got a very good track record on that. I think one of the worst constitutional judgments is Jordan's case, where they refused to give rights to sex workers. And the point, if I can make it ahead of you, is that if you give rights to sex workers, they have all the rights under the Labour Relations Act. They are a worker like any other worker. And then you can start dealing with the issue. While it's hidden and criminal and stigmatized and ignored, in fact, as if sex doesn't happen, we can't deal with it, can we?
No. And, I mean, again, I realize that there are all these moral issues around sex work that people have.
Yes.
But we're living in a country and in a region that is the hardest hit by HIV.
Yes.
And one of our greatest commitments has been to ending the HIV epidemic in South Africa and in the region. And we can't do that if we continue to criminalize sex work.
Yes.
But what happens instead is that sex workers are afraid of the police. When their clients are violent, they don't go lodge complaints. They're afraid of healthcare workers because they know what they do is illegal and they're afraid of being turned in. Again, we've had stories of sex workers in South Africa and in the region who are detained by the police and then are raped without protection so that they can get out by police so they can get out of jail. If sex work wasn't criminalized, then even if women were detained by the police, they'd have rights so that they didn't have to agree to rape without a condom to getting out of prison. So it's unclear to me that if we do claim to be committed to stopping HIV, why there hasn't been a real push to decriminalization. And I think one of the most depressing things, most recently in South Africa, has been that, the National AIDS Strategic Plan for 2012 to 2016 originally had a provision calling for the decriminalization of sex work, and that was pulled out at the last minute. Which
I mean, this is the National HIV Strategic Plan for a long period,
4 years.
4 years, and we all sort of gave a cheer when the first draft there it was, decriminalize sex work, and suddenly it's disappeared.
Yeah, and it means a real lack of commitment, I think, by the government on decriminalizing sex work and seeing that as a critical pillar to its HIV prevention efforts or response efforts.
Yes, it's a strange conservatism. I don't know what it is that people don't recognize that it is there. I mean, sex is the biggest industry in the world, and it's just sort of this pretense that it isn't there and somehow it's a nasty criminal thing, when in fact it's going on every day, probably by everybody from parliamentarians downwards.
I'm sure. One of the things that's been interesting is that we have a case in Malawi around...
yes, give us an example of that, because that's a very tragic and real example of how it works.
Yeah, so this is a really small town in Malawi, and there was one night where the police came into a bar, known as a sex worker bar, and detained everybody in the bar. Within a few hours, they let all of the men go, and they kept the women. They kept them overnight, and then the next morning, they basically took them in police custody down to the local hospital.
Yes.
And as they say it, their blood was extracted from them. They had no idea what it was for. And then later they were taken to the magistrate's court, which again is and this is a one-road town. So the magistrate court is just next to the hospital.
Yes.
They get taken there, and the magistrate reads out in public their HIV status and then charges them with, and convicts them of spreading infectious diseases. There's been no proof that they've spread the infectious diseases. A lot of the women, it was the first time they ever learned their HIV status.
Well, you can't imagine the list of constitutional rights that infringes, isn't it? I mean, the privacy and freedom of bodily integrity and dignity and privacy and discrimination against women. I mean, the list is endless, and it just happens overnight in a small town in Southern Africa.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is that going to court?
It is going to court. We have filed papers in the High Court, and we're waiting a government response, which we have not gotten, and it's been about 6 to 8 months.
Yes.
So we are compelling the government to provide a response in the next few weeks. And we're hoping, again, to have a hearing next year.
What do you do? Do you get an order? Are you suing for damages, or what do you sue for?
We're suing for damages, and we're suing for a declaration that mandatory HIV testing is a violation of a specific constitutional rights.
Yes.
And so that it's not only, and again, it's not only sex workers that are mandatorily tested. If, everybody... If they mandatorily test sex workers, they mandatorily test other people as well.
Yes.
And so this is a way of protecting everybody against the forced HIV testing.
And of course, the extraordinary thing, the men all get let go. None of their tests are done. And it's just done upside down.
Well, and not only that, there's no proof that transmission has taken place. So I'm unclear as to how one can convict somebody of spreading infectious diseases without any proof that infectious diseases have been spread.
Yes. I mean, that Malawi would be what we call a common law jurisdiction. They've got sort of a system of law based on the British system, ultimately, I suppose, where you're innocent till the state proves you guilty, not some sort of forced testing and then some assumption that's never led in evidence at all, and then you're a convicted criminal for when you should never happen.
Yeah.
Is it possible to appeal those sentences, or to appeal set aside the whole criminal decision?
I think it probably is. We are not doing that. They were given a fine, and I think a lot of anybody who's worked with sex workers, and a lot of sex workers probably will say that they have fines all the time.
Yeah.
They'd rather sort of get out of the again, they'd rather get out of the criminal system and just do their work as safely as possible.
Yes.
Both in terms of sexual transmitted diseases, but also in terms of their own bodily protection.
Yes. We've got a few minutes left. I'd like to deal with one positive note, and that is mother-child transmission. That is one of the success stories, perhaps, in Southern Africa. Can you give us some background to that?
Sure. I think that, and South Africa has done an excellent job, and I think a lot of countries around Southern Africa have done a really good job in terms of preventing mother-to-child transmission and ensuring that pregnant women at some point are able to get the needed treatment to, again, ensure that their child
How do you prevent it? I mean, what is the mechanism for preventing the transmission? Strangely enough, it doesn't happen in the womb, does it?
It can happen in the womb, and it can also happen during delivery and then after. And there's specific drugs that a mother can take to prevent the transmission while the baby is in the womb, and then even upon delivery.
It doesn't have to happen in the womb.
It doesn't. And
it's completely preventable.
Yeah, it is completely preventable. And that, from what I understand, the numbers. It's 99% preventable in 99% of cases. So the truth is we shouldn't be seeing any child really being born having HIV from his or her mother. But at the same time, I think governments have done a really good job in terms of reducing the number of babies.
Yes, that really has been a success story, and it's appropriate too, because the poor innocent baby is about as innocent as you can get in any system, legal or moral. So if we can do that, we've got to congratulate. Is that happening in Southern Africa besides South Africa? Yeah,
it's happening, throughout Southern Africa. The numbers are incredibly low. Treatment. And again, we're not doing as well as maybe one would like, but HIV treatment across the region, and even in South Africa, is definitely better. In South Africa, you're talking about the dark days of the Mbeki administration, but we've really come quite far in terms of getting people on treatment.
Yes.
I just think we need to probably do a little bit more in terms of ensuring that people stay on treatment and others get access to treatment.
Well, Priti Patel, it's been very nice talking to you, nice is maybe not the word in some of the examples you give, but it's been very informative. Deputy Director of the Southern Africa Litigation Centre. You do have a website and a Twitter address, and if people want to keep up with your work and follow how some of these cases are going forward, if they've got some millions out there, you'd welcome them, I'm sure.
Please.
We wish you every success, because you're doing sort of really an important job in many countries where nobody's represented. So thank you for your presence, and thank you for a very interesting program.
Thank you very much.
Good night, and goodbye to the listeners. This is the last program for the year tonight. I'll say goodbye to you till next year. It's been a great deal of, I wouldn't say fun, but I really enjoyed bringing the Bill of Rights into the public issue. So goodbye, and have a good year end.
Pro Bono Law, hosted by Patrick Bracher, was proudly brought to you by ProBono.org and Norton Rose, South Africa, in association with the Constitution Hill Trust. ProBono.org, actively increasing access to justice. Pro Bono Law, hosted by Patrick Bracher, is proudly brought to you by ProBono.org and Norton Rose, South Africa, in association with the Constitution Hill Trust. ProBono.org, actively increasing access to justice.
Welcome to 1485 Pro Bono Law. This is your host, Patrick Bracher, welcoming you to another program where we deal with the Constitution